Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today I'm doing my first Epic History TV video, Alexander the Great Part 1. Let's get into it.
In 334 BC, Alexander, king of Macedonia, began one of the greatest military campaigns in history against the superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. Just 20 years old, his brilliant and fearless leadership won him battle after battle. And in an astonishing 10-year campaign that took him to the edge of the known world, he carved out one of the largest empires ever known. Few men have had such a massive impact on the course of history. To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, but to the West, he was immortalized as Alexander the Great. Ancient Greece. From around 500 BC, this rugged land was the scene of remarkable developments in art, philosophy, and warfare. Its two greatest city-states were Athens, a naval power where democracy, art, drama and philosophy flourished, and Sparta, an austere, militaristic society famed for its formidable army.
So throughout Greek history, or classical Greek history, you have Athens and Sparta that are the most well-known, I guess, superpowers of that time period. However, there is a third. There's kind of a trio, and historically, the last one gets left out a lot, and it's Thebes. The Theban military is known as one of the best militaries in classical ancient Greece, and there kind of is this constant rotation of who actually is on top of this mountain. And so as the time door kind of revolves, you'll have Sparta that's on top and kind of has hegemony over Greece. And then as that door revolves further, Athens will take hold of it, and then it'll evolve further, and then Thebes will get a hold of it. But those are kind of the three great powers of Greece at this time period. And actually, by the time that Alexander the Great goes in and retakes over or establishes Macedonian hegemony over Greece, Sparta is not the Sparta that we know of historically. They have lost a lot of their power. Thebes kind of came in and kicked them in their teeth and released a bunch of the helots. And so Sparta was not the power by the time of Alexander the Great that they had been historically. And in fact, they don't sign on with Alexander kind of having control over all of Greece. And they are so not the power that they used to be that Alexander doesn't even go down there and stomp them out and make them join. He's just like, yeah, whatever. They can do their own thing. They're not really a threat.
In 480 BC, these two city-states had joined forces to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by 300 Spartans held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy. But they couldn't prevent the Persians burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The next year at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians and forced them to abandon their invasion. The next 50 years were the golden age of classical Greece. But rising tension between Athens and Sparta and their allies eventually led to war, dragging the Greek world into decades of destructive fighting.
So the Persians are actually involved in a lot of this. The Persians come over. Initially, they have their entire fleet kind of get crushed and swept aside in a storm. And so then they come back later using much more land. They still have their fleet with them, but it's there kind of to supply the military force as they travel much more on land the second go around. After you have the initial Battle of Marathon, and then you have Thermopylae, you have the burning of Athens, and then eventually you have a slew of battles, a handful of them happening kind of in quick succession, where the Persians end up getting kicked out of Greece. Well, the Persians at that point decide, okay, militarily, we are not equipped to fight the heavy infantry that the Greek hoplites have at this time. They were used to fighting much different militaries, horses, chariots, faster armies, and their military was very good at handling those types of militaries, could not contend with the heavier equipped hoplites. So what did they have then at their advantage that the Greeks didn't if it wasn't their military? Well, two things. One, they were all Persian. And so although they had these areas that were kind of on the periphery of the empire as a whole, they had a inner circle, I would say, of these like quote unquote nation states that were wholly Persian. And so they were unified and the Greeks were not. And that was one major thing they had going for them. And then because they were unified and because of the size of the empire, they had a massive, massive amount of gold. And they knew very, very well how to use that to influence different groups and to have things kind of fall their way. And so that's what they did. When their military couldn't beat Greece, they said, okay, well then we'll use our gold. And they actually start paying and influencing a lot of these Greek city-states to go to war and fight each other. And the Greek city-states really don't need much prodding here. They have long past of hating each other, hating specific other city-states. So with this little bit of nudging by the Persians, they go almost into constant conflict.
Wars between the Greek city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to a new rising power to the north. For centuries, sophisticated Greeks had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, Hicksville, barely Greek at all. But under King Philip II, Macedonia emerged as a formidable military force. His most famous reform? The introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbours. Now, following this victory, he united all Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside. Philip began to plan a great campaign, a pan-Hellenic or all-Greek war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now an ailing superpower, its great riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard. victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, brilliant, restless, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. At home, he had potential rivals executed, then crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a special example of Thebes, completely destroying the ancient city and selling its people into slavery.
So what happens here is, whenever Alexander the Great comes into the throne of Macedon, or is trying to get the throne of Macedon, he actually has a very influential Macedonian general that takes his side in this whole thing, and essentially that backing allows him to take the throne. But whenever Philip II is killed, you have, not just in Greece, but all over these places that Macedon has conquered, you have them all starting to revolt at the same time, and you can understand why. Philip was killed, Philip was who conquered them. There's probably going to be some destabilization in the court and around the throne of Macedon, and so if you're going to revolt and get away, now's the time to do it. So Thebes immediately does this. Athens also does, but more so in spirit than in actually doing it. They were much slower than Thebes in actually pushing back any sort of Macedonian influence. And so once power is consolidated and Alexander firmly has the throne, he immediately goes down and burns Thebes to the ground. As a response of, you said that Macedonia and the Macedonian throne were established as the hegemon of Greece as a whole. When you revolted, you completely went against your word of essentially Macedon having that power. And so in response to you turning against your word and the Hellenic League as a whole, then you're going to be destroyed. And he sets a strong example with Thebes. And yeah, they're literally, he burns it to nothing.
In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks or rear.
Okay, so this is exactly the changes that allows Alexander to be so successful. The Greek army does really, really well if they have its flanks guarded. These phalanxes do really well if you have something guarding the flanks. They are extremely strong if you hit them head on. They are very hard to maneuver inside of a battle. And so you have a lot of cases where essentially if anything or anybody gets around the flanks or rear of a Greek army up to this time period, that Greek army is done. Whereas the Romans had the third line that they always had as the reserve units, where if something was going poorly or somebody started attacking a flank or something, you could send in that reserve unit to kind of clean that up, that Greek army is totally destroyed at that point when that happens to them, until this point. And Alexander makes changes to the regular Greek phalanx that provide maneuverability inside of battle. And it's really what allows him, one of the things that allows him to be so successful on the battlefield is that maneuverability.
So 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists, or shield bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well armed and heavily armoured for the time. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen, armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callas, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Erigyeus, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. The Great Persian Empire.
Look how big that damn empire is. People really have a hard time putting into context how much territory the Persians conquered, especially when coming into a world where the superpower is Assyria, and then under Assyria, Babylon and places like that. This is a massive amount of territory. Imagine somebody conquering this much territory today. It's really crazy how much of the known world this is at the time. And Alexander's going to take it all.
Was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. So they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire. Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies.
So, this is very common at this time. Like I said, Persia uses their gold for a lot of things to do with Greece, including having Greeks fight in their army. If you can't beat a Greek hoplite, okay, well then just pay them and have them come fight for you, which is what they do. However, once there is a mostly Greek army coming to fight, they do not trust that these Greeks that they're paying are actually going to fight for Persia because of the gold. So they end up, in a lot of cases, putting them way in the back and saying, you know, y'all are basically reserve units. We'll use you if we have to have you. But they absolutely did not trust the Greek mercenaries to fight other Greeks for Persia.
At this time, these men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing he posted Thessalian, Greek and Thracian cavalry under Parmenian's command. In the centre were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager and Crateros. On the right, Alexander himself with the companion cavalry under Philotas, as well as the elite Hypaspists, the Agrianes javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of Hypaspists and the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river.
So historically, this is super dangerous to do. Basically, a couple of things can happen that would make this go very, very poorly for the Macedonian army. One, this companion cavalry and the light cavalry that's being taken across the river right now, they could just be pushed back, and in that case, that's not terrible, but you lose cavalry kind of for nothing because you can't cross the river with your infantry, and so kind of nothing happens and you just threw troops away for nothing. On the other hand, they could start having mild success on the other side. The companion cavalry and the light cavalry of the Macedonian army could start having light success. That success then has the infantry troops start to cross the river. And then those Macedonian cavalry start to get pushed back. And at that point, all of the infantry that's in the river are basically just sitting ducks waiting to be killed by Persian cavalry. And so this is a very dangerous idea, but that's one of the things that makes great generals great, is that in situations that seem less than ideal or even outright poor, they are able to somehow find a way to get a victory out of it.
As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses, and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank. The Persians determined to prevent them crossing, and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless. But he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then, suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles. Reuploaded rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Mithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. But the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already, it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings himself. Research and...
Alright, that was Alexander the Great Part 1 by Epic History TV. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you guys next time.